everyone, welcome back to another Genshin Impact video. Now, in case you have not been keeping up with the hottest Genshin drama lately, a lot of people all over the world, in China servers, NA, EU, there's a significant number of people saying that Zhongli feels underwhelming, he's weak, he was overly nerfed, and personally, having pulled on him, I got him C0, I've been trying him out with a couple different builds, and I am solidly in the camp that he does feel underwhelming and that he does need a little bit of love just to bring him up to the 5-star level that he is supposed to be. So what we want to do in this video is I tried to break down Zhongli using a MECE format. So we're going to be looking at each component of his kit and then thinking about what problems each of those components has and thinking about potential solutions for those problems. So if at the end of this video, if there's some ideas that we missed that you want to talk about, feel free to leave a comment and we would love to discuss with you. So without further ado, let's get started. First things first, his base kit. So here there's two problems, the first being anti-synergy with his skills. This is most noticeable in his E, where you have two options, one is the pillar and the other is the shield. The issue here is that the pillar gives energy regen and the shield gives, obviously, defensive utility. Now the problem here is that the damage wave that comes out when you use the shield does not generate any energy for you. So essentially you have to choose between charging your ultimate or having a shield. And this is especially problematic when the shield breaks and it's still on that 12-second cooldown. So it's actually going to be a while before you could even make the choice to get energy or re-shield yourself. And in harder content like farther stages of Abyss or even AR45 plus domains, the shield might not last as long as you're expecting. So that's the first problem. The second problem is that he has anti-synergy with his scaling. So if you look at his kit overall, he has HP scaling on his ultimate and his shield, he has attack scaling on every part of his kit, and then his ascension bonus is geo damage. So with all of these three things, it makes it so that if you're investing in one or the other, you're losing out on scaling from the other two components. And so a really easy fix for this would just be making his scalings more consistent. Either have more of his skills scale off HP, or make more of his skills scale off attack or geo damage. Make it so that you can invest in one of those things and just use him comfortably without feeling like you're sacrificing other parts of his kit. So the second component of Zhongli is going to be his basic attack. This is really obvious what the issue is here. It has really low damage. Our suggestion is to just give a straight buff to the attack percent modifiers or potentially convert to geo damage. Now, having geo damage auto attacks comes with pros as well as cons, so we think that the better idea would just be to increase the attack modifier so he has a little bit more flexibility in his kit. Moving on to the next part of his kit is going to be the elemental skill, and so we're going to break this down into two parts. First is going to be the tap pillar and the second is going to be the hold shield. So for the tap pillar, the first problem is low elemental skill damage. So anybody that's played Zhongli knows you do not use his tap pillar for damage. If anything, you would use Tap Pillar and then pair it with Geo MC or Ningguang for a fun little resonance playground, but on its own, the damage is pitiful. Now, what can we do to help? The first idea is obviously increase the attack scaling, because right now, at I believe level 6, it's about 22% for the initial hit, and then 45% for every resonance pulse. And while this does have potential running with Geo MC or Ningguang, having too many Geo characters on your team can actually be a disadvantage, especially when you're faced up against enemies with elemental shields. So another idea, if we don't want to increase attack scaling, could be to give some kind of lasting debuff. So we're just going to make one up and call it Brittle, where it increases Geo damage or physical damage taken. And I think this would pair really well with giving Zhongli that supportive playstyle where you could put down a pillar, and then it actually debuffs enemies to enable either his own damage or the damage of his allies. Moving on, we have what's arguably the biggest problem in his entire kit, and that is unreliable energy recharge. Now, as far as I'm aware, and this is watching videos from Jinjing's testing as well as talking to some other theory crafters, the general consensus is that there is no consistency in how it generates energy. So some solutions here could be that the pillar summon generates 1 energy per enemy hit on impact, and each resonance tick should also generate 1 energy particle regardless of the number of enemies hit. This change, I think, would be really good in the sense that it creates a more skill-expressive playstyle where you actually want to try to hit as many people as you can with the initial summon, and you're rewarded for better play. And finally, the last problem with his tap pillar is going to be the short range. Again, if you've played Zhongli, you know how difficult it is to keep enemies within that resonance range. And if you're out in the overworld and you're fighting hilichurls or treasure hoarders, it's not that big of a problem because you could just knock them back in, and they're not very mobile to begin with. But when you're fighting against, let's say, Whopper Flowers or Abyss Mages, enemies that are just jumping around and teleporting and have a bunch of mobility, it's very, very difficult to keep them inside the range. And you could say that you could just reposition it, but again, when you do that, you're sacrificing your shield, and there's no guarantee that they're going to stay in it even after you reposition. So some potential ideas we had to improve this skill were to either increase resonance range, obviously, or give it a gravity effect. And this is another debuff that we just made up, where enemies within range have slowed or no movement. So small enemies that are trapped in the resonance maybe have extremely slow or no movement, and big enemies can still walk out of it. Moving on to the hold shield. So the first thing that comes to mind is vulnerable hold time. It takes a 2-second hold to summon the shield, and during this time, you're still vulnerable to taking damage, and you're vulnerable to being interrupted. Now again, in the overworld, probably not going to be that big of a problem, but in content that's actually challenging, this is going to be a pretty significant liability. And so some ideas to help with this, switching the tap and hold functions, so shield becomes instant, and then the pillar summon becomes an aimed ability similar to the way Geo MC works. You could also reduce the shield cast time, bring it down from 2 seconds to 1 second, or give it damage and interrupt resistance while casting. Another problem with Zhongli's shield is that it's very selfish, at least until C2. So right now, if you're playing solo, it's not that big of a problem, but every time you go into co-op, there's a reason why Zhongli players get kicked, and that's because he doesn't really bring anything to the table. You would expect after miHoYo's official statement that Zhongli was supposed to be used as a support, that he would actually be able to provide supportive utility to his team. But his shield, until you get Constellation 2, is just for himself. And so the obvious fix to this is just allow allies to be shielded if they're within the hold radius. And this is a nice segue into the last point regarding his shield, which is that it has no utility. Compared to other shielding in the game, where the character can apply their respective element and thus enable elemental reactions or have even more bonus utility, Zhongli's shield doesn't really do anything and it's just a big HP soak. So some ideas to bring this up to par is, if we're looking at defensive utility, you can have the shield cleanse. If you're looking for offensive utility, you can have the hold E damage on Geo constructs applied to enemies that have been petrified. Moving on to his actual elemental burst, the single problem that I have with this is that Petrify has no utility. And I know what you're thinking, Petrify is a utility on its own. It's a CC and you can still get elemental reactions off, it's pretty useful. But the problem with this is, not only is the duration very short, but it's designed entirely for CC. So some ideas here are that 1, Petrify duration should be increased, otherwise apply Brittle debuff to support damage, and Brittle is the same debuff we talked about earlier that increases Geo or physical damage taken. And speaking of Geo, that is going to be the last component of this list, and I have 2 problems with Geo. The first being Crystallize eats reactions. Now this is a bigger problem than you might expect, because first of all, Zhongli's pillar stays out on the field for a long time, and it's his only way of generating energy, so you want the resonance ticks to hit enemies. The problem is, it takes away the opportunity for his teammates, or even if you're playing solo, your other characters from fulfilling elemental reactions and getting off that extra damage. The way that Crystallize currently functions kind of goes against the overall philosophy. So our suggestion is that they make it so that Crystallize reactions generate shield particles without absorbing the applied element. Aside from that, this last point is something that we touched on earlier on in the video, and it's that crystallized shields don't stack. So if you get a crystallized shield, and Zhongli has already used his shield, or let's say you're shielded by someone else, the crystallized shield won't provide any benefit, and it just takes away from the reactions as we had mentioned earlier. So a simple fix that we thought of was just to allow crystallized shields to stack with character-generated shields, but not other crystallized shields. It actually makes Zhongli a little bit tankier, which seems to be the direction that miHoYo wants him to go in, without making it broken for co-op play. And that's the end of our suggestions. Now with these solutions, we're not expecting all of them to be implemented because obviously he would be way too strong, but just looking at these ideas, you can mix and match some of these solutions and fixes to create an ideal Zhongli, one that would fit miHoYo's intended playstyle while also not gimping the players that have him. And so if you have any other ideas for how you can make Zhongli stronger, if you think some of our ideas are bad or we forgot some ideas, feel free to let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. Stay tuned for more Exo Heroes and Genshin content. Thanks for watching, and we will see you guys next time. Peace.